Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, welcome to episode 7 in our holiday series for 2021, where we're talking about the impactful or important questions to ask of potential candidates in leadership roles. And, so far we've had a lot of questions so far over the last few weeks. And on this episode, episode 7, the question that I want to talk about, it might seem really black and white, like, oh, you ask a question and you get an answer. But I'll tell you, I've had some people think that they've answered this question well when I've gone up to them afterwards and said, hey, how'd your interview go? And they go, oh, I aced it, man. This question, it was amazing. I loved it. I was on fire. And then they tell me what the question was, what the answer was. And I'm thinking, yeah, you might not be as on fire as you thought you were. and so I think it's an important one to address here. And that question is, how did you execute a successful key initiative? And it can be answered a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different ways to ask that question of a candidate. But basically, it's tell me about something that you were successful at. You had something you had to roll out. It wasn't necessarily your idea. It wasn't necessarily something that you came up with at the high level, but it was your goal and your job to make sure that it was executed with the people who report directly to you. And that's a different thing, obviously, than having to execute something that you came up with on your own. This is basically, having to find the buy-in in yourself in something when you might not have all the answers, you might not have all of the resources necessarily, or the clear idea of exactly how to do it, but you still got to come up with it anyway. Have you ever had a candidate answer this question in a way that was kind of lackluster, and how'd that go?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, I see it as either one. I think that to answer this question, it can be your idea or it can be a directive that you have to follow. Because really what I'm looking for, the reason why I say this, what I'm looking for is specificity in some details. And I'm actually looking for the ability for somebody to talk about like what they observed, kind of how they approached it, what changes, adjustments, or how do they look at what they were being asked to do and really consider all the players at hand and who needs to do what. So I'm really looking at an overall element of leadership in regards to kind of a higher level of executing a strategy. Typically, to answer your question, when it's kind of gone lackluster or gone wrong, they tend to be either vague or it tends to be a theoretical question. Right, a theoretical answer. Where it's
how
like,
would you execute a successful key initiative, right?
That's a great question, Chris. I think that the ability to execute a strategy is really based upon the chance to create buy-in and it's just like this,
right.
The answer in theory. But I will always say that questions like this, I want to hear a name and I want to hear a number.
Yeah.
Like that's the level of specificity, but I also don't want a 10-minute answer.
Right.
You got to be able to kind of explain and walk yourself and walk the person asking you the question through the idea of a start, a middle, and an ending. But those are just a couple things when I hear this question that I'm really listening for and assessing for.
Right. The things that I like in situations like this are, like you said, an actual name and a number sounds great, but I want to hear that right up front. I want to hear the punchline of the joke, and then I want to hear the joke, because I don't want the person to be figuring out what the punchline is in the middle of telling the joke. The old the Michael Scott Office adage where he says, sometimes when I start answering a question, I don't even know where it's going to go. I just kind of like see, see where it takes me.
Yeah.
So a successful key initiative, if you have one, if you've done that well, then you know the name and the number right up front. So then that answer to me starts with, oh, it was the time that I worked with Lorenzo and we took this number from this to this, because that was the goal of the organization. And let me tell you how I did that. And we started with this, and you work backwards. The ability to do that means that it's not made up. Like you came up with it, you had that name and you had that number. That story was already in your head, which means you could start at the ending. You don't have to think about it as you went along. So you don't have to make it up. And if the person says what the ending of the story is first and then works backward from that, it's really hard to come up with something theoretical when you start with the actual real number and the real name of what you did and how you did it. And so I'm looking for kind of that situation, because in my head as an interviewer, I'm starting in my head with that number now. You've told me the punchline, the outcome, the result of the key initiative, and now I want to hear how you did it. That makes it so much easier as an interviewer to not have to try to connect the dots while I'm listening to the story. I already know what the dots are supposed to look like at the end. It's showing me, hey, this is the finished picture. have a look at it. Now I'm going to paint it for you. And because I want to, in my head, I want to see, oh, this is where he did this and this is where he did that. If he starts out with just this vague starting of the picture, in my head, I'm spending half my resources listening to the story, and the other half of me is actually trying to connect the dots, trying to figure out where they're supposed to go. And that actually takes me out of the moment of trying to figure out what they're telling me. So yeah, I want to see the finished outcome first.
Yeah, I think it's a great point to call out. I love the idea of kind of the punchline first, and then also as you're assessing somebody answering this question, really, do they understand what's behind the question, or are they just answering a question? Because this one for me is very much around, kind of strategic thinking and the ability to, like, what's the question behind the question?
Sure.
And like, if I hear a question like that, that's what I'm assuming. I'm assuming that you want me to provide you a very specific example of how I've leveraged my influence as a leader,
right,
in getting some work done and either achieving or exceeding whatever the goal was that we were focused on. And so I think that's those things, that's really good advice, and it's really good as you're assessing talent to understand, like, did they get that? Did they understand that this is about this type of question, and are they answering it in that kind of way, or are they just like, let me tell you a story,
right,
and we'll get to the end of the story eventually.
Right. So I want to go back to something you said earlier, and that's that you look at it in two different ways. It can be something that was your initiative, or it could be executing the initiative of somebody else. And there is a big difference in that, and I want to talk about that a little bit. But first, I want to give it up to word for one of our sponsors. All right, so I think there's a difference between executing an initiative where it was your idea versus one where it was given to you by somebody else. Just in terms of if you bake it up yourself, you kind of know more about where you want it to go, and you're already bought into it. You know what resources you're going to need. Sometimes when things are given to me to do, there's a lot of dots I have to connect, but I have to do that while simultaneously helping my people connect those dots and start executing. I can't wait till it's fully baked in my head before I can start. I got to start right away. I want to talk about that with you a little bit, because you said there's a difference between the two. Do you find it just as easy to do one or the other, or do you feel like it's different when you've done it in the past?
Well, I think it's flexing two different, like, skill sets and competence. To your point, like the ability to take initiative and have an idea, look at something, address it, observe, strategize, implement, execute, like the ability to do that, the proactiveness nature of saying, like, I have personal ownership, I have personal accountability to make a change or to approach something that I see as an opportunity. I 1,000% agree that that's kind of one element of a skill or competence. Then the other one is the ability to execute upon a strategy without maybe having all of the answers, or without it having to be your idea. And that is just as valuable in a lot of instances. And more than likely, that's actually the thing that most people have to do more often, is just take this and go make it happen. Now, it does require, though, elements of, okay, Chris wants me to go do this, but I will have to sit back and think about how I'm going to do it. And if it can just be, we need this thing to get better. I may have to take that thing and then take a strategy that says, and we want it done A, B, C, D, E. Well, you and I both know in the people business, there's A1, A2, B4, C7, where, like, you have to make these little pivots to get it done, whether it's a result of somebody who created a strategy who doesn't do the job every day, or companies and organizations or leaders that give you the larger building blocks, but not the specific ways to get it done. So I see them as two different skills and competence, but in the element of this question, I'm okay either way. I'm okay with you saying, I had this idea, or we had this initiative, and then here's kind of, again, how I was able to start with the punchline and work my way through it. I think based upon how they answer that question with each one of those, I'm probably going to have a different follow-up to dig a little bit deeper to understand, can they also flex the other muscle?
Right. I think it comes down to there's almost another sub-question that gets asked when it's somebody else's initiative, and that's the, how do you build belief or buy-in around something when you don't necessarily 100% believe in it or know all the answers yourself. And that's almost a sub-question that is being asked when it's somebody else's initiative as opposed to your own. But yeah, I agree with that completely.
And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And have a great day.